I think the crisis actually is presenting the answers to your question. In other words, in healthcare, we've had a predatory capitalist healthcare system for a long, long time. And it's not even a system. It's a raggedy, jerry-rigged kind of thing. If you're wealthy, you get the best healthcare in the world. If you're employed in a union job, you get pretty good healthcare. If you're poor, the message is take care of yourself. I mean, it's an atrocity. That contradiction has pushed itself forward. Everyone can now see it. And what was considered radical when Bernie Sanders raised it during the Clinton campaign, and he said, healthcare is a human right, healthcare for all. Everybody said, wait, that's some kind of socialist communist nightmare. What's he talking about? There's not a single Democratic Party candidate who doesn't endorse the idea that healthcare is a human right. The same is true in education, but it's up to smart folks like you and like your organization to say, here's the new deal for education coming out of this nightmare. And one of the new deals for education is to push the College Board aside. Let's just take a look at the SAT. The SAT is driving curriculum, it's driving teachers, it's driving kids crazy. I'll tell you two quick stories about the SAT. One kind of tickles me because in my faculty, when I was a professor at the University of Illinois Chicago, and I was the only distinguished professor of education at the university, and we were having a meeting about whether we should have PhDs and EDDs. PhD degree and also an EDD degree. And the argument was, oh man, the EDD is a lesser degree. It has no prestige. I finally raised my hand and I said two things. One is I said, I have an EDD. That's all they gave at Teachers College when I went there. So I don't have a PhD. But somehow I've been able to function with a lesser degree. Secondly, I said, everybody makes a big stink about, testing and so on. We let graduate students in how they did on their graduate record exam. I don't think anybody has ever asked one person in this room what score you got in your SAT. And one of my colleagues from psychology raised his hand and said, I've been pissed off about that ever since because I got an 800. Nobody's ever asked me. Exactly. Nobody cares. It's a gate you go through. Nobody cares. And it means very little except how you do on the SAT. I find it interesting that the SAT was once called the Scholastic Aptitude Test. And then they realized that didn't quite say it, so they changed the name to the Scholastic Achievement Test. That was wrong also, because it has nothing to do with achievement. So now it's simply called the SAT, which in a perverse way is perfect. All it is a test which tests what the SAT tests. So and everyone knows another thing everyone knows, and we can rip the cover off this as well, is how you will do on any high-stakes standardized test that you take will depend on how you did on the first one you took. And the main correlation with how you did on the first one you took is income and academic level of your parents. So why don't we just get rid of the whole costly thing and line people up and say, how much money do your folks make? Okay, you go over here. Or something equally cynically stupid, because the SAT is cynical. It's covered with all this academic research and all this idea that it means something. And then you see educational researchers, scholars who, I lived with for the last 30 years as a professor. And they always, when they do their research studies in schools, they always say, well, I'm using the standardized test scores as my baseline, even though it's irrelevant, but it's the only thing we've got. Let's get something else. Let's get teachers in control. I want to also just quibble with one thing. You said teachers are not treated as professionals. I understand that the desire for teachers to be professionals, and they are professionals. But I worry that when we say professional, we're thinking of ourselves as, how could we be more like lawyers? And I think we should reject the idea of professionals in that regard in terms of teachers, and think of ourselves as professionals of a new type. What marks us as professionals, what marks lawyers as professionals, is they have control over the content and the conduct of their work. It's not a question of wearing a suit and having conferences at the Hilton. It's a matter of having control over the content and conduct of your work. That's what I think teachers should have. And I think the whole, corporate school reform push has been to deprofessionalize and take away power from teachers and say the collective voice of teachers is irrelevant. Let me go to two more quick points and then relook at this. But two more quick points. One is that kids of privilege, and I think that one of the things we can do when we talk about real reform is we have to ask ourselves, what do the most privileged people have for their children? And we should ask ourselves in a democracy why that's not true for all kids. So Arne Duncan, who was in charge of Chicago schools for 4 years and the nation's schools for 8 years, so it's 12 years he's a school leader. He comes back to Chicago. He can't find a single public school to send his kids to, even though he's been telling us for 12 years how we ought to do these things. He comes back, he sends his kids to a private school. I don't blame him. I get it. I'm for it for him. What I'm against is him advocating that the rest of us deserve something else. He sends his kids to a school with a class size capped at 15, with a full arts program, including music and drama, with standardized tests are taken, but they're taken a third of the time that Chicago Public Schools kids, a third of the amount of testing that Chicago Public School kids take. So how does he do that? And I went over, one of my standard tropes is whenever the Chicago Public Schools do something that I object to, I go over to the school where Arne Duncan sends his kids and I ask them how they do it. And one example is that a few years ago, the Chicago Public Schools banned the book Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, the great story of coming of age during the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Brilliant, brilliant graphic novel. And they banned it in Chicago. And the reason they banned it is because on one page, a kid is peeing in the street. It's a 150-page book, and you can see his penis, and nobody would want that, so it's banned. So I go over to Arne Duncan's school, and I say, do you guys have Persepolis in your library? Oh, yeah, we have 12 copies, including 2 in the original French. I say, do the kids read it? Oh, yes, they're required to read it before 7th grade. Oh, my gosh. So the kids of privilege get real art and real literature, and the Chicago Public School kids get another hour of drill and kill. So similarly, when the Chicago Public Schools were required to assess their teachers, 30% of the assessment of their teachers was based on kids' test scores. So immediately I went over to this privileged private school and I met with the principal and the head of the union. And I asked them how, by the way, it's unionized. And I said, how do you all assess teachers? And they gave me a 2-hour talk, which I won't repeat for you. But in essence, it involved a period of induction into the profession. It involved mentorship. It involved a constant conversation throughout the school community about what makes good teaching. And then it involved kind of peer coaching and peer observations, and it was quite elaborate. At the end of it, I said to them, well, how much, in your evaluation of teachers, how much do standardized test scores count in evaluating teachers? And they looked at me and they said, well, what does that have to do with good teaching? Thank you very much, people of the privileged. But people of the not privileged get something quite different. So I think we should say what the privileged get for their kids, we have a right for all of our kids, number one. Number two, we should note that high-stakes standardized testing distorts everything, and we should fight it tooth and nail. This is the perfect time to come up with alternatives.